All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Moving to Google Workspace, What You Need to Know. We appreciate you joining today. And the first thing I'd like to do is just take a second and introduce our speakers on the next slide. My name is Shayna Horka, and I work in product marketing here at Gimel. And I am joined by our key speaker today, Gimel product manager, Rick Wilson. Now, before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to go through. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A section on your screen, and we will answer as many as we have time for at the end of the presentation. There will be at least one poll question pop up, so please keep an eye out for that. It will be a second window that you'll see open up. All answers are anonymous. And as always, if you have any technical difficulties, please let us know so we can assist you. So to kick things off, I have just a couple of slides here to tell you a little bit about Gimel and how we can help you take control of your information with our suite of solutions. Gimel is an information governance software company founded in 2002. Our mission is to help you achieve your information governance goals by providing solutions that balance the value your information provides with the risk it also presents. Whether you're trying to discover information in unstructured data sources, migrate from legacy systems, or comply with policies across multiple repositories, Gimel can help you achieve your information governance goals. We have a client success team and a global network of partners that deliver solutions in conjunction with key partners like Microsoft and SAP. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about Gimel's family of software products and how they work together to let you create an efficient digital workplace. Our comprehensive solutions include migration from legacy systems, file analysis and e-discovery, electronic and physical records management, and document management for SAP content. With that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Rick so he can get started with today's presentation.
Thanks for that introduction, Shayna, and I'd like to add my welcome to all of you who joined the meeting today. I know we've all got packed schedules. Here at Gimel, we follow a process called the Scaled Agile Framework for our development planning. We're in the middle of a product planning week, so things are extremely busy, but it was nice of you all to take some time out of your schedules to join us today. So let's talk a little bit about Google Workspace. As many of you probably know, about a year ago, Google announced Workspace as the evolution of their G Suite productivity platform. And according to Google, with a purely cloud-based implementation and focus on collaboration, Workspace offers a more integrated experience than G Suite, which obviously is kind of their marketing tagline. But it's important to understand that it is an evolution of their Office product line. And the key bullet points that you see on the screen here, the 1 through 4, are really the components of the Google Workspace suite that they're expanding on for their customers and trying to kind of play up a little bit. Interesting to us, though, as a vendor who works in this space is, although historically Google's kind of been relegated to a second tier behind Microsoft, we see that landscape just starting to change. And if you take a look at this chart that's on the right-hand side of the slide here, it depicts how Google's starting to, and I emphasize that, they're just beginning to crack into this market share here, but they're starting to challenge Microsoft 365. That's a pretty impressive statistic in the blue circle of 48% year-over-year growth. And that's from 2019 to 2020. Interestingly enough, those aren't numbers released by Google either. These are estimates performed by Gartner, as you can see on the slide, based on their conversations with customers who are using the Google environment. So historically, people think of Microsoft 365 as the leader in this space, and certainly it still is in terms of volume and overall dollars, but we're starting to see Google emerge and start to challenge that market dominance that Microsoft 365's experienced. So if you are currently a G Suite customer and you have not moved to Workspace yet, there's a couple of things in particular that you need to be aware of. And the first is you can't stay where you're at, right? So there is no path forward with the G Suite product in the Google environment. In fact, they're requiring customers at contract renewal to migrate from Google Suite to Workspace. So you really don't have an option in whether or not you adopt the Workspace platform. The second bullet point here, which is a little less obvious, is that your licensing fees may not be consistent with what you perhaps are used to in Google Suite. So we're not saying that's an absolute, but the evidence is that there are a lot of circumstances where licensing is much more expensive in the Workspace environment than what you might have been used to in your G Suite product environment. Here's a couple examples of that just graphically. So a lot of this, as you might expect, depends upon what edition you're going to be migrating to in Workspace. We'll talk a little bit about editions in just a moment, but just be aware of the fact that there can be some dramatic price changes in terms of licensing fees as you plan out that migration. Interestingly enough, again, Google's not terribly forthcoming with this information. In fact, if you go to their Workspace pricing webpage, the last time I looked at it, which was last week, the only pricing information I could find was around some of these business plans. So anything else, whether it's the entry-level tiers, we'll talk about in just a second, or whether it's the enterprise, they were really vague on what that pricing looked like. So you may want to discuss this with your Google sales executive as you're starting to plan that migration, and make sure you don't have any unpleasant surprises in terms of licensing fees. What are some of the things that you can do, or you might want to look at doing as you start to contemplate this migration and decide whether you stick with Google or move to another platform like Office 365? Well, one is to engage with your Google account manager. So there are several tiers inside the Google Workspace environment. There are 3 business tiers. So there's Business Starter, Business Standard, and Business Plus editions. There are several enterprise tiers to choose from, but there's also a frontline worker edition. There are product editions for education, nonprofit, and government. All of those aren't terribly, there's not a lot of information about how those are priced. So it's worth it to have a conversation with your Google executive to talk about what edition might be best for you and whether or not you can flex some of the restrictions that might be on that edition. That kind of plays into strategy number 2 here. So what I mean by that is all of these tiers come with, as you would imagine, specific allocations of product or services. For example, those business tiers that I talked about earlier, so the Business Standard, the Business Enterprise, the Business Plus, those are relegated to organizations with 300 or less users, according to Google's official pricing mechanism. So if you have 450 employees, technically, according to what Google says, you're not eligible for one of those business tiers. And in fact, you'd be kicked into an enterprise pricing tier, which does bring into play some of those pricing increases that we mentioned on the earlier slide. So that's one example of being able to maybe negotiate with Google in terms of flexibility and how you might want to approach the product edition that you're going to migrate to. Another example might be, for example, Workplace Enterprise features 100,000 viewer limits on live streaming with Google Meet. Is that something most of us will ever need? Probably not. So there are other sort of characteristics related to these plans, maybe the amount of G Drive storage, for example, that's included in a plan that you can negotiate with Google on, or at least attempt to negotiate with Google on to secure perhaps a better pricing model for your organization. And then strategy 3 here is to look at ways that you can maybe move out of the Google environment or perform some of the functionality that you might need to do with your unstructured information, things like governance, oversight, regulatory compliance, maybe retention policy application, those sorts of things, with another tool outside of the Google space, which could allow you to stay at a lower tier again of the Google platform. So if you can provide some of that regulatory oversight with a third-party tool like Gimmel's products, you may be able to avoid moving up to one of those pricey enterprise tiers. So with some of that in mind, I'd like to take a few minutes and just explain how Gimmel can perhaps help you with some of this environment. And we're going to be talking about that in context with a Gimmel product called Gimmel Discover. Discover is our information governance platform inside Gimel. As Shana mentioned, we've got solutions for a wide variety of information management. Discover in particular gives our clients the opportunity to perform data governance. Data governance could be oversight of your unstructured content for use cases like searching for sensitive data, or perhaps applying retention rules or managing that content. All of those would be examples of things that could be done with data governance. There's a classification component that allows you to apply your record categories to particular types of data based on their characteristics. Personal, private, confidential, contains PII. Those are like the examples of what classification looks like from your environmental view. And then thirdly, there's an e-discovery component that's available inside of Gimel Discover that allows your legal teams to be able to find information quickly in the event of a legal challenge. This also can be useful in two other cases that we've seen a lot of interest in around lately. So one of those would be providing some kind of response to a FOIA request or maybe a DSAR request. So if you're in a situation where you need to be able to find information relevant to a public records or maybe a data subject access request for GDPR or CCPA or something like that, e-discovery can also help in those situations. It's also being widely used by privacy organizations, individuals inside the organization. So privacy users can use the e-discovery to be able to search for sensitive data that might be exposed in a fairly simple fashion. All of that functionality that we talked about in governance, classification, and e-discovery is powered by a common set of software that our clients install inside their firewall. So if I click on administration here and I go over to the data sources area in my Discover implementation, you'll see a list of content areas here that connect to Gimel Discover. One of the things that was very important to us as we architected this tool was to provide visibility to a wide variety of content. So of course, our main focus today is talking about the Google environment from a Google Mail environment and Google Drive environment. But there's a number of other areas that you might want to apply these kinds of management oversight to. That might include network file shares that are in your network environment, SharePoint or OneDrive, PSTs, other types of mail or box storage. We're actually about to add Microsoft Teams to this list too. This coming weekend, there'll be a release for the Microsoft Teams product. So not only can we address your Google use cases, but we can also allow you to manage additional content outside of what you might be seeing in Google. It becomes very important if you're looking at maybe growing the organization. We see a lot of this with acquisition where an organization acquires a new company and they're using a different standard. Maybe they're on Office 365, even though you're standardized on Google, and you need to be able to manipulate or manage that content. Great way to be able to perform that. I wanted to show you a little bit more about some of these functional areas that we talked about today. So once we've connected to these data source areas, we can move to the functional level of Gimel Discover. I'm going to start with our e-discovery view here. Inside e-discovery, as I mentioned before, your legal teams can use this to find information relevant to a litigation that you might be involved with, or you could use it for those privacy or public records requests we talked about earlier. All of that happens by building a search. So in my search interface here, you can see I've already filtered down to some of my Google examples. If I bring this back to an all view, you can see there's a number of searches for different use cases across the environment. Let's go back to just our Google view here. And you can see I've got some searches against Google Mail content over here in the data source area and Google Drive content. In both of these situations, these examples were performed against a litigation type scenario. So your chief legal counsel comes to you, they said, hey, we've got a subpoena for a particular case. Here are the keyword terms that we need to be able to find inside the Mail or Drive environment for these employees. We call those custodians inside of e-discovery. And Discover allows you to format that search criteria. So you can supply all of the information around what's relevant for that search, information about how you want to handle your search results, where you're going to look for content, which custodians, drive, or mail users information you want to be able to search. Make things like date ranges and age and size, and a number of criteria around how those keywords are going to be performed. So we've got things like what we call proximity searching here. Look for these two words, Sherpa near 10 software, or, and then we've chained that together with ethical or Houston or Enron and gas. So you can see that kind of logic allows you to build very sophisticated queries to go out and find information relevant to that search response. You can even determine where that information is going to be searched inside, in this example, a mail scenario. So do we want to look at attachments or not? We can make that decision as we build our search. Those searches are then applied by the Discover client agent component. They go out and they build what's called a responsive data set. And now you've got visibility to what people are actually keeping inside their mailbox to help you respond to that legal challenge. So I can see whose Gmail account that information came from. I can see some information about that item. So maybe the size. Over here is what's called a snippet. This is the portion of that email that triggered one of our search terms. And that search term is highlighted in yellow. Over to the right, we've got information about the item itself. And you'll notice in the first column here, these little pink icons, if we hover on them, they see full text view available. Sometimes, especially in the case of litigation, you need to be able to get more context around a result. Hey, we know that it contained the word notes, which was one of our search terms, but what exactly did that particular item include? So it gives us a view actually into the content of that email. Now this message is still resonant in the mailbox where we locate it, but we've extracted a text version of it, and this is an option you specify when you run the search. We've extracted the text to help your legal team determine, is it important to this particular search request? Is it relevant, in other words? And based on the fact that it may or may not be relevant, you can then select that item, and you'll notice this little blue tag here. This is called a label. Under the action, you can apply labels that indicate some subsequent action you might want to take on it. Hey, we want to gather this one up and collect it to hand over to outside counsel. Maybe it's not responsive. This is an item that is not part of this litigation or this FOIA request. We don't want to pay any more attention to it, even though it had that word. It's outside of the scope. Perhaps it's privileged and we're going to have to redact information, that sort of thing. So you can build out a set of labels that tag or sort of accompany your business review process, and your legal team can then use those to build the collected set of data. So that's an example of how the Discover environment can help you from a Google point of view with litigation kinds of situations. Let me jump quickly to a data governance view just to give you an idea of what is included inside data governance. So data governance allows you to be a little bit more granular about how you're going to manage that information moving forward. That begins with what we call workflows. You see over here on the right-hand side of the screen. And workflows are a canvas where you can articulate your business rules and map out the various criteria that you want to use to manage your content. Those workflows are then executed by a policy. So in the policy area, we tell Discover to run that set of business rules, that workflow, against a specific mailbox or a specific group of users or a specific office location, however that needs to be applied in your world. If I pop over quickly to this screen, you'll notice the fact that we're looking at one of those workflows in that Canvas application I talked about earlier. So the workflow begins in a kind of a flowchart paradigm. This one examines a Google mailbox, and we could assign that mailbox individually or by a group or a user. It opens the mailbox, starts to look at the message tree, and then at the message level, we're going to two different tests on the content of that email message. We're going to look for the fact it might contain a social security or it might contain a credit card. But there's a number of other criteria that you could use to apply this rule. We call those decisions. So these are all decisions that could be applied to that email item as you decide how you want to manage it. For example, maybe you're applying a retention rule and you only want to look at items that are more than 2 years old. This allows you to be able to apply that kind of a message age. We're only looking for specific senders, that sort of thing. In my scenario here, we're actually examining content. So you can see at that step where we check for the social, we've added a message content test. We've selected the message body to apply this to, although there are other areas available. We could, again, select the subject or the attachments, for example. And I'm applying a pre-built expression pattern for a Social Security check. So you can see that pattern SSN syntax. But I could extend this, and I could add additional criteria to that check if I wanted to. That could also have been an and criteria. And there's some options about how we want to handle those search results. For example, in the credit card example, we're using LUN verification to validate the fact that the item we pull back does pass that LUN algorithm check for a potentially valid credit card. This again allows you to orchestrate those business rules. They can then be sent to the Altitude console or Discover console for you to be able to review and applied at the policy level to your sensitive content. And you wind up with perhaps a report where you've got maybe a list of those sensitive items that you can review and move forward on. A little bit of lag here. There's our sensitive data scan loading. So now we can see there's a credit card, there's a potential Social Security. And just like in e-discovery, we do have some masking going on so that all that PII is not exposed. You can opt to bring back the full text view of that item to get a little more context. Again, an option. Some clients love it and some don't like it so much. And you can, likewise with e-discovery, you can mark or label the item for subsequent action. So maybe in this example, because it has a credit card, we don't want to retain it in the system. So we can mark it for deletion. And you'll notice over here in that gray column, now that item's been tagged for future deletion moving forward. So lots of ways to manage your content inside that e-discovery and data governance module. I mentioned earlier the fact that we can also classify it. This is a little more straightforward use case. This is examining content items for particular criteria and then applying a label that matches, as I said earlier, personal, private, confidential, that sort of thing. Those labels get added as metadata to your file, your text, your email, and then we can interrogate those later, find all the items that said they contain PII and delete them after they're 6 months old, for example. So that's a quick view of what Gimel Discover has to offer and can apply to your Google environment as you move forward and help you manage that information. I hope that was somewhat helpful. And I think, Shana, we had a poll that we wanted to float out.
Yeah, I also want to remind, I know we have a couple of questions in the chat, but I want to remind everyone, feel free to put your questions in the chat. Rick showed a little bit about Gimel Discover, but if you'd like more information, if you'd like to see a bigger product demonstration, you should see a poll pop up right there on your screen. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the questions. Is the potential price increase based on users, storage, or the extended features offered in Google Workspace?
Yeah, it's actually a combination of all of those. So as I mentioned earlier, those business editions that Google's delineated with Workspace all have a user limit of 300. So consequently, if you've got more than 300, now those are out of scope for you. But on the other hand, maybe you need more than 2 terabytes of Google Drive storage, which might also push you out of that. So all of those parameters could be taken into account when you have your Google pricing developed.
Great, thank you. The next one we have is, how does the tool you showed help with saving money on the migration part of the workspace migration or transition?
Yeah, sure, Shana. So a couple of ways. Oftentimes in those migration situations, you're looking for specific functionality. Maybe you need the ability to search content for legal, or you need to be able to apply a retention role. That capability only comes with certain tiers of the Google platform. So by using a third-party tool, you can oftentimes buy into your Google tier at a lower tier level, which saves you money from a licensing point of view, and provide that kind of governance, e-discovery sort of functionality outside of that environment.
The next one we have is, do you recommend moving to Workspace before trying to clean up our Google environment with maybe the tool you showed, or doing this ahead of time? Oh, I guess it is. Do you recommend doing it after the move versus ahead of time?
Yeah, so from a volume point of view, I think the only consideration would be if the Google tier that you're thinking about moving to in Workspace accommodates the volume of storage that your users typically have. So if your users like to keep a lot of information, for example, in Google Drive, terabytes of content, that's going to limit what Google tier you're allowed to buy into. In a situation like that, you could use a tool like Discover to go through and remove or perhaps archive to a network file share or some other area some of that old content. So now we can buy into a lower Google level tier that doesn't offer as much G Drive storage, but saves us a ton of money on licensing fees.
And the last one I have, unless another question sneaks in, is how soon should I start looking at reducing any storage space with G Suite in order to avoid the price increase?
Yeah, so again, that sort of ties to when your contract renewal comes with Google. So I would think that, maybe 6 months out from whenever your Google contract renews, you need to take a hard look at this, have a very sort of honest discussion with your Google account executive about what they think they can offer you in terms of pricing, and then decide if the tier that they're recommending is something that you want to move forward with, or if you want to take one of these other actions like reducing the amount of Google Drive storage, or maybe pulling some of the functionality out, like e-discovery type capabilities that might be offered in Google's environment, and providing those with a third-party tool.
Great. And we actually did have a question sneaking. Is there a plan to sunset G Suite anytime soon?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, G Suite is going away as your contracts renew. So they're not going to pull the rug out from underneath any G Suite users as long as those contracts are in effect, but you don't have an option to stay on that platform whenever your contract expires.
Yeah, I guess the first step would be to figure that out. Whoever you need to
Absolutely.
talk to figure out when your contract's renewing.
Right. Big question. Yep.
Great. Well, that was the last one. If you guys can think of any more questions, both of our email addresses have been up there on the screen. Rick, if you want to go to the next slide, if those are too hard to remember, I know I have kind of a quirky last name. You can always visit us at www.gimel.com or email us at info@gimel.com. For those interested in the recording of this webinar, we will be sending it out between 24 and 48 hours in the form of a thank you email. So please keep an eye out for that. And it will also be located on our website if you can't find that email. And we hope to see you on our webinar next week, Upgrade or Start New. Thank you everybody for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Shana.